We are set now, I think.
Yayındayız.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Sadık Ünay from İstanbul University, Department of Political Science and International Relations. I would like to welcome you all to the book launch event organized for Turkey's Electoral Geography, Trends, Behaviors and Identities, which is edited by Edip, Asaf, Bekaroğlu and Gülsen Osmanbaşoğlu. It's my pleasure to be hosting this event. Just to give you a brief idea about the flow of the program. At the beginning, we will have an opening speech by Michael Wuthrich from Kansas University. And then we will listen to the ideas of the editors, how they felt, how they struggled to bring together this volume, and the academic intellectual implications of this whole effort. And then we will have short presentations by the author of each chapter. We didn't have a full structure, I mean, in terms of time limits and so on, but this is more like a flexible program. So I assume that everybody will follow a responsible timeline. Otherwise, I will cut the presentations. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Michael. Michael Wuthrich currently works at Kansas University's Political Science Department. He has a PhD from Bilkent University. His research interests are on political parties and elections in Turkey and Middle East. He's the author of National Elections in Turkey, People, Politics and the Party System, and published in Journal of Democracy, Middle East Journal, Mediterranean Politics, and so on. So, Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to me. It's very early morning here. And dear authors and the guests, dear guests that are watching. It's a special privilege, actually, to be able to do this and to introduce this, I think, great new book that's written really by, I think, I can say excellent scholars and many, many dear friends. And to be able to have this event under the sponsorship of the historic and prestigious Istanbul University is also a great honor. So I was asked to share some of my thoughts about the book's themes and the contributions found within the work. And I think to do so, we need to ask several questions. Like, why does political geography even matter? Why, in other words, why do we need to consider space and spatial variation? And why is that important for a careful and nuanced study of Turkish politics? Well, I think in answering that question, I can turn to another iconic scholar in Turkish politics, Ergun Özbedün. I think he began to illuminate this. He was one of the people, anyway, that began to illuminate the answer to this question around 45 years ago now with his seminal work. I don't know if you all have read it. I would highly recommend it. Social Change and Political Participation in Turkey. The very important book for me also in my studies and discovery. But in the book, if you're not familiar with it, Professor Özbedün takes survey data, much of which had been collected and gathered and that he got in coordination with another very notable scholar in Turkish politics, Frederick Fry. And the purpose of the work, it was to understand why, how politics was operating, how it was functioning, how people were thinking about political preferences and attitudes, not in general, but he divided it up and tried to understand it in different areas of Turkey and different regions and try to begin to understand why that was important. And even at that early time, I think in this, we could say, innovative work, one of the things that he began to do to show us that was, I think, really important to me, and I think the scholars writing the book that we're talking about today, was that distributions of identities, social identities, and political identities and political preferences are important. And there are different reasons for that. And I think he pointed out trends that showed that if we weren't paying attention to what was happening in different places, we couldn't really understand what was going on. The sum total of the results wouldn't give us the full explanation, right? And so certain classic simplifications of party preferences and conflict, like center periphery, really don't make sense once you start looking spatially and geographically and historically, right? The contradictions, just even in, support and preferences for the center changed so dramatically from the started, its fortress was the least developed areas of the country. And of course it moved over time to the more developed areas of the country. But some other things that he noted that were completely a tremendous contradiction and a surprise to the comparative literature and political science was that in Turkey, from the data that he had from the late 60s and early 70s, voting turnout, voting behavior, and feelings of political efficacy, that is, to what extent do citizens, individuals feel like they have power to affect their representatives, actually was stronger in exactly the least developed and least aware, politically aware portions of the country. So that in Eastern Turkey, people turned out to vote in much higher numbers than the people in the Western part of Turkey that presumably and surely on the survey data appeared to know more about what was actually going on politically. They turned out in higher numbers. They also felt like they had greater access to their political representatives, which Professor Özbedün begins to explore at that point. But understanding these dynamics in Turkey have also been important over time. We can still see reflections of this. And the other thing that he really pointed out was the important variations too in the assumptions that we made and the realities that exist in urban political preferences versus rural ones, and other voting behaviors. But it didn't, obviously, Turkish politics didn't just stop with that one work 45 years ago. There have been, when we think about electoral geography, there have been a number of nice studies over time, and I can think of ones in recent years, and I know that they're referenced actually in this work that we're talking about today, but there have been works on particularly cluster voting, electoral studies that have pointed out to us that the party system and politics on the ground look very different from region of the country to region of the country. And if we don't understand that, we don't completely understand what's going on in Turkey or why people are casting their vote or behaving politically the way that they do. And so through this, we've been able to see variations in the importance of identity in different places, right? Ethnic, religious, and other kinds of political identities. Other things that space tell us are very important is to pay attention to the impact for gender and women, for example, in various areas of the country. It's very different. And as we'll talk about in this work, which also covers most of these topics that I'm talking about, just even in my own work, the discovery that if you think about as recently as 2002, when 24 women entered parliament at that time, those 24 women came from 7 provinces in Turkey, and probably the ones that you would exactly predict, right? Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, a few other provinces in the west. I think Gaziantep was the one further east that would have stood out in that number. But by 2018, right, in the 104 women that entered parliament, we also have well over half of the provinces in Turkey represented from east to west, with maybe a few notable clusters of provinces being absent in the change. But you see a huge geographic shift, right, and the implications of how and where women are entering politics and for national politics and for whom. It's very important. And the regional differences, and some of those regional differences have been more acknowledged and others not. But I think we see the importance of that. The other thing that space tells us that must be important, if we think of these differences and everything that we're talking about, if the environment, if differences in space lead to different implications for politics, that also means that we should pay attention to the fact that the way that people compete, the competition for politics, and what parties are doing in different places necessarily must be different for them to be successful, right? And perhaps even to the extent that they don't change might be what makes them more of a regional party or not, ironically, right? When you think of a nationalized political party, you might think of one that has one message for the whole nation, but that those messages usually get relegated to regions unless they have nuance that understands the way that politics works in different places. So, and in some of the research that I'm doing now, I see this importance of space, and whether it's related to women and gender, or like how, you know, one of the things that I'm trying to explore more now is why, for example, we have known historically in Turkey that Kurdish voting behavior, for example, is extremely volatile. And I think it makes, to some extent, we understand that as close observers of Turkey, but it's interesting to think about how that doesn't make sense at all, right, in a comparative political understanding of the way ethnic politics work and voting, and try to think about that and explain it, and to understand why identity politics would also be concurrent overlap with high levels of volatility. And so, you know, I see this importance of space in my own work. And so I was extremely thrilled to see that this one was being produced and is now produced. And we have this great volume that actually is covering many of these issues that I've already begun to discuss. So you know, in case no one else is going to proudly show the banner flag of this great new book, I will. But I think, you know, even in some ways, it offers a much richer look at electoral politics than even what Professor Özbedün was able to do 45 years ago, because it's addressing so many more issues from so many different angles and lenses, both quantitative and qualitative. And I think that's really important, and in many ways can reach a lot more scholars. So, I mean, just let me briefly kind of outline some of the great themes that I think that are taken on from chapter to chapter in the book. Just obviously the authors are going to talk about it in much better ways than I am, but I think thinking shortly about all of these different issues of space and how they come together is important. So, you know, I think even the introduction chapter by Edip, Asaf, Bekaroğlu, and Gülsen, Osmanbaşoğlu. Even there, I think we have a good start because they make even in that beginning chapter, I think they make a very good argument for why this regional variation matters, right? And that to the extent that we're just looking at what happened in Turkey in general, we miss some of the dynamics across space and how those dynamics across space are also changing across time. But then I think very appropriately in the second chapter, the book, for those of you who haven't bought it and picked it up and read it yet, it tackles the issue of party and party system nationalization. And I think it's important to understand the Turkish context related to party and party system nationalization, and also how the implications of that and how that relates to other party systems in comparison with others. But again, if we really think about how the party levels party fortunes across the country are very different, as I think we all know. But it's interesting to think of the implications of that, and what that means, going back to things that I mentioned before about women in politics, or other things. If parties are competing in different ways, it also means it has different implications for how candidates are selected, right? What the priorities in candidates are, how they campaign, what they do. And there were very few times in Turkey where we could say that party system nationalization and party nationalization was very high, right? So, and one of those points was 1950, and the other point was the first two elections right after the 1980 coup, 83 and 87. Party system nationalization was really relatively high, even at 87, as this party system was fragmenting. The way that voters behaved toward those parties were fairly consistent from province to province, which itself is kind of a surprise, considering that does not reflect what was normally happening in most other elections. Then Gülsen Osmanbaşoğlu also in chapter 3 tackles the issue of gerrymandering. That's obviously a very relevant issue, not just in 3 p.m. Turkey, but also in 7 a.m. America right now, and those questions of voters and how political parties try to manipulate the system to maximize their vote. And so one of the things that she points out in the chapter is the way that the granting or punishing of provinces its intent, I think, for the party to grow its success. Often the story didn't turn out, the outcomes weren't exactly as they had hoped, as she discusses in that very interesting chapter. Tanju, Tosun, Betül, Aydoğan, Ünal, and Gülgün, Erdoğan, Tosun have a really interesting chapter, I think, on the Western coastal regions and voter outcomes. And I think they do a really nice job of looking not at the predictable outcome that we expect, that, oh yes, look, center-left parties have done better there, especially post-1980, but also they do a good job of discussing the limitations and the implications of this relegation of center-left success, I think, in that region, and what that means. And so that's a very interesting chapter. And as we think about regional clustering of party fortunes, the next chapter by Hüseyin Alptekin also really looks at the regional issue from a very different perspective, from the perspective of the pro-Kurdish leftist parties, HDP and all of its predecessors. And that chapter specifically looks at how those parties try to mobilize votes in very different areas of the country. So looking at how does a party like HDP or its Kurdish predecessors or the independents that ran loosely under those previous parties' banners, how do they try to explain their party and their party's goals and promises in the West to a predominantly Turkish audience versus to a predominantly Kurdish audience in Diyarbakir. And it might not be surprising that it's but it is interesting to think of how systematically it reveals that we see a much more new left sort of appeal in the West and a much more pretty much Kurdish priority appeal in the southeastern provinces. There's also within the work, another thing that we see being discussed spatially there's two very nice chapters related to women and politics, chapter 6 and chapter 8. So the chapter by Selin, Akyüz and Kürşat Çınar in chapter 6 looks particularly at women's cooperatives. I think this is really interesting to see spatially where these are laid out and the implication of those women's cooperatives and how that affects politics in the area and then women's varying access to power as they exist and expand and where they are and where they aren't and the implications of this. So very interesting, not one that I think all of us have thought about enough. So I think that's a great contribution. And then Mezher, Yüksel in chapter 8 looks at some of the things that I mentioned earlier about the advance in the number of women in national politics in Turkey in general, going all the way back to the first 18 women who entered during the single party period and while Atatürk was still living in 1935, all the way up to the present in national elections. And I think through his descriptive detail, you can see very different patterns or some of the initial priorities and emphases of the initial period, the single party period, and the women and the representatives and the variation in their or somewhat limited variation in their occupation and various other things compared to the increasing greater variety of women coming from an increasing variety of places across the country as the number of women in parliament has grown in recent years. Chapter 7, Ayşenur, Kılıç, addresses looks at election monitoring, and I think this is a really interesting chapter with original data and study of these various election monitoring organizations and understanding who these people are that are doing the election monitoring and what brings them out. And I think one of the things the chapter points out is that there's a real limitation on who's actually doing this monitoring. And the question is, why? Is it a lack of interest, or is there exclusion from these groups? But the fact that those that are really monitoring elections closely from the data that she gathers, obviously it tends to overrepresent obviously the opposition, and particularly the secular coastal West, and even more particularly the views and priorities of the CHP or the RPP, the Republican People's Party, more than other parties. And to the extent that we want to see I think most of us would see the high value in election monitoring and what that does to electoral integrity, it points out the need and the limitations for it to be primarily engaged in by one particular segment of society. And so that begins an interesting exploration, I think, into that topic. And then finally, chapter 8 written by Necati Anaz and Mehmet Köse actually begins a very interesting discussion. Some of the things that I'd never even thought about before until I read that. So really great from that standpoint, looking at diaspora voting, overseas voting, in particular in Turkey and the implications of that for Turkish politics, but also it's looking at its policies and practices and the way that has occurred and what the way that it currently operates, and also begins to explore other options like even the idea of an overseas election district and representation. So I think I appreciate the fact that they begin the discussion on that topic. So it was interesting for me to read and think about in that way. So I've already been talking probably for too long, but I was thrilled about this book and really found a lot that was valuable to me in each of the chapters by all of these authors. So I would enthusiastically agreed to be able to introduce it because I couldn't recommend it more highly, and I congratulate and applaud all of you who contributed to the work. So I will stop there with my introduction and to turn it over to the smarter people who actually did the deep dive into the research areas of each chapter. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. On behalf of all the participants, Mike presented a very elaborate account of the chapter by chapter account of the book and went into the details of some of the analytical issues. I think some of the points will be clearer when we hear from the authors as well, and maybe we can have a discussion platform as well. Now we move to the editors and we start from Edip Asaf Bekaroğlu from my department at İstanbul University. Edip focuses on comparative democratization, autocratic politics, political parties, and elections. He's a very productive political scientist, as you know, and I would like to give the floor to Edip.
Well, actually, Gülsen, she may go first.
Yes,
I guess. Yeah.
I'm just following the list that you gave me. So if I was allowed to, I will be always a gentleman and give the floor to Gülsen. No problem. Okay, then let's move first with Gülsen. Gülsen Osmanbaşoğlu is from Social Sciences University of Ankara, Department of Political Science and Public Administration. She focuses on Turkish politics, political parties, elections, and modernization. And please, Gülsen, you have the floor.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to talk about briefly the story of that book, and then Edip will make a broader introduction. Actually, the story of that book dates back to Middle East Association's annual meeting in 2016. And I was working on a chapter on gerrymandering, and also I asked some of my colleagues, Özhan, Edip Hoca, and some others. And one day I saw Professor Metin Eper at the Bilkent campus and asked him whether is it appropriate to present such kind of panel at that meeting or not. And he said that, yes, you can, and also write my name as the chair. I said, wow, it was a kind of stunning offer for us at that time. And he really came to Boston with us, and also dearest Mike was present there as our panel's discussant. And also then we just decided with Edip to expand the scope of our panel's content. We just wanted to add some new interesting issues such as gender representation, diaspora's representation, election monitoring organizations' positions and such. And then we just asked our colleagues and our very dear faculty members and other related people whether they can contribute to our book with their works or not. And then also we just prepared a book proposal. To be honest, we were rejected one time, and then Routledge really accepted that book. But it was a really sluggish period, because it didn't end with that acceptance, because we need to consider different editors' constructive feedbacks, and we just tried to fulfill their expectations and their really valuable comments. And then we just launched our book, and we are now very excited to hear your also constructive feedbacks. To be honest, it is a really teamwork, and all of our contributors did their work in a quite perfect way, and they just did their work in a timely fashion. And also, as the characteristics of social science, we should have some gaps, mistakes, deficiencies, and such. And we are eager to hear your feedbacks in that regard. And I just want to thank you to all these people who contributed our books with their chapters, comments, and also encouragements in that process. Thank you very much for you all.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I can
Okay.
continue.
I'm here. Thank you. Thank you, Gülsen. Now we move to the other editor. I already introduced Edip. Okay, Edip, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Michael Wuthrich for delivering this fantastic and instructive opening speech. Thank you for doing this, Mike. Not only that, but his book, National Elections in Turkey, was an important guide for us. If you haven't read so far, I strongly recommend you to do it soon. It's a very comprehensive and enlightening study of political parties and elections in Turkey. Then, of course, many thanks to the contributors. They were so patient and hardworking during the publishing process. As Gülsen said, this dates back to 2016, and just the publishing process took about like 3 years. And thank you for being patient for during this process. And they are also so kind to attend this meeting. I want to thank also Hasret Dikici-Bilgin. I'm looking forward for hearing her comments. I'm sure it will be very fruitful discussion with her contributions. Finally, I'd like to express my gratitude to Istanbul University's Faculty of Economics and my department, of course, for hosting this event, and Professor Ünay for moderating this panel. Well, in my talk, I'm going to shortly share some aspects and important points that myself and my co-editor Gülsen outlined in the introduction chapter of this book. Then I will give floor to our contributors. First, let me show you an electoral outcome map. Just a second. Yeah. This is from 2018 elections. Anyone interested in Turkish politics is very familiar with this map. Since 2002, we have seen very similar versions of this map, right? In the western districts, we see Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi. In the southeastern districts, a Kurdish political party, currently Halkların Demokratik Partisi, dominates. And in the remaining districts, Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi wins the majority or plurality of the votes. Of course, such maps oversimplify the complex nature of voting behavior. And it is for sure that inferring causal relationships from these kind of maps can be very misleading. Yet, clearly there is a geographical pattern here. So what might explain such pattern? Is it about regional differences in terms of socioeconomic development, or is it specially concentrated identities that determine electoral behavior in Turkey? Do these patterns pertain to 2000s, or do they have their roots in multi-party politics since the beginning? Or perhaps this all coincidence, right? Temporary fashion. So such questions can easily be diversified for the Turkish case. And we asked these questions and wanted to make a comprehensive study that analyzes these questions from various perspectives. And we hope that this edited book fills a gap and encourages more comprehensive studies about Turkey's electoral geography. In terms of electoral geography, we argue that the Turkish multi-party politics can be divided in two distinct periods. The first period includes the elections between 1950 and 1977, where center-right and center-left parties were the predominant players in the democratic game, and also their performances did not show significant regional particularities. So this is the era of political centrism. The second period, on the other hand, starts with the 1983 elections and comes up to the present day. With the rise of Kurdish and Islamist political parties, Turkish electoral geography started to show indicators of regional dynamics. And this can be called as the era of centrifugal politics and regionalization. And to illustrate this periodization, I like to show you a graph from the book also, very shortly. So here there are four cities, four representative cities actually: Erzurum, Gaziantep, Eskişehir, and Van. We choose these four cities from the four voter type clusters categorized by Çarkoğlu and Avcı in their 2002 study. Erzurum here represents the first cluster, where far-right and peripheral voting behavior is dominant. And Gaziantep represents the second cluster, where the voters are more likely to support center-right political parties. Eskişehir is a typical example of the third cluster, where the center-right and center-left are more evenly represented. And Van, finally, is dominated by pro-Kurdish and religious parties. And for the sake of reducing the complexity of graphs, we combine the center-right and far-right voters into one line, but I will briefly explain their impacts. As you can see in the figure, the voting patterns are indeed clearly distinguishable in these four cities. While in Erzurum, right-wing tendencies have been sharply evident since the beginning of multi-party politics. In Gaziantep, the gap between the left and the right opened in the 80s, after 80s, to the benefits of the right-wing parties. And in both cities, the presence of the left continuously dropped but not as much in Gaziantep as in Erzurum. On the other hand, Eskişehir voters seem largely stable in their ideological orientation. Also, in contrast to other cities, the left-wing tendency is generally firm and consistent in Eskişehir. Finally, the voters in Van have frequently changed their preferences, as you can see in the graph, especially in the first period, I mean, before 80s. In spite of this, since the mid-90s, left-wing voters have almost disappeared and right-wing parties have suffered serious drops in support, while pro-Kurdish parties have made a strong appearance. Pro-Kurdish parties also made some appearances in Gaziantep and in Erzurum, more or less in accordance with the national averages, but interestingly not in Eskişehir. So these are some general trends in Turkey's electoral geography since 1950. This is actually a descriptive historical analysis. And let me stop here and leave the floor to our contributors and Hasret for open discussion. Thank you all for coming and those watching.
Okay, thank you, Edip, for the nice presentation. Now we move to the discussion of the chapters, and we start with the second chapter, titled Measuring Party Nationalization in Turkey 1950-2018, and Özhan Demirkol from Niğde University, Department of Political Science and Social Science, I think, will present the chapter. The floor is yours, Özhan.
Dear all, I'm a little bit excited, so in order to stop my excitement, I prepared the power presentation, so I will present it. Okay.
Okay, go on.
Let me share it. I hope you can see this. Can you see this, by the way? We prepared this chapter together with Edip, and I would like to thank you for your kind participation. Today, we'll present the findings of our study on party and party system nationalization in Turkey. Firstly, I should define what the party nationalization is. A political party is considered as nationalized when its national vote share is evenly dispersed in all electoral districts. I mean, for example, think of a party that receives 1% of vote. If it receives 1% of vote in all electoral districts, then it is perfectly nationalized one. But, for example, the example, if we speak about the example that Edip presented, if, for example, the votes of Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi is regionalized in one sector of Turkey, then it's a less nationalized party. Nationalization of political parties became more important with the concentration of the votes of major opposition parties in the southeast or the coastal electoral districts. In fact, before the 2011 general elections, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan claimed that the opposition parties were non-existent to the east of Sivas. And he was saying that Sivas'ın ötesine geç görelim seni to Devlet Bahçeli, the leader of Nationalist Action Party. And in fact, I started to study this work after this speech. I mean, does it hold true? And similar to my study, our study, to what extent does this claim hold true has been researched by various scholars since then. Party nationalization is a measure to evaluate this claim. It has been previously used by two studies, one in 2019 and the other is 2017. But these studies had some shortcomings. First, they excluded minor parties, And secondly, they didn't make calculations for all the elections. In fact, we presented this chapter in 2015, and these two works were later written, but our study was published a little bit later. So what did we do is that we intended to fill these deficits and calculated the nationalization scores proposed by two different scholars. Party nationalization and party system nationalization indexes of Jones and Mainwaring were used to compare Turkey with other countries. But later, more sophisticated methods were developed, and standardized party nationalization score of Boschler was one of these. It was used to calculate party nationalization, since it is more sensitive to the changes in the number of electoral districts and their population sizes. And here are the findings. Here are our findings on party system nationalization. Regarding the nationalization at the party system level, we found the followings. Firstly, compared to other countries, Turkey had a moderate level of party system nationalization. Secondly, party system nationalization was distracted by military interventions. Thirdly, Turkish party system has gradually evolved into a less nationalized one. And finally, party system nationalization was negatively associated with the effective number of electoral parties. At the second part, we conducted party-level analysis in three main periods and found the followings. Democrat Party had the highest level of nationalization between 1950 and 60. Republican People's Party was more nationalized than the Justice Party, which was unexpected for us, between 1961 and 77 elections. And from 1980s to the 2002 elections, the Motherland Party had the highest level of nationalization. After 2002 elections, we found two main trends. Firstly, the Justice and Development Party had the highest level of nationalization, and second, Republican People's Party turned into a less nationalized party, which was demonstrated in the figure by Edip. Finally, we made calculations for the nationalist, Islamist, and pro-Kurdish parties. Islamist and Turkish nationalist parties were less nationalized until the 80s. Since then, nationalist parties became more nationalized than the pro-Islamist parties. Moreover, the pro-Kurdish parties, as expected, remained highly regionalized. Our study was one of the first comprehensive attempts to analyze the nationalization dimension of the party system in Turkey. We made some suggestions about the impact of the institutional design or the identity politics on the nationalization, but we believe that further studies should be conducted on the factors influencing party system nationalization. This is all my presentation. Thank you for your participation again.
Okay, thank you, Özhan, for this nice and precise presentation. Now we again move to Gülsen Kaya, Osmanbaşoğlu. She will present the article Gerrymandering in Turkish Elections since 1950, Resetting the Rules of the Game. Gülsen,
Thank you.
you're ready?
Thank you very much. Yeah,
Okay,
I'm ready. I just want to briefly summarize my chapter.
Okay.
I just deal with the contextual framework of the gerrymandering, which is a tough literature because there is no consensus on the effectiveness of the gerrymandering processes, whether they work efficiently or not. And the strategies of the gerrymandering can vary also. For instance, we can talk about three basic strategies of gerrymandering, which are based on concentration of votes, allocation of opposition parties, and also incumbent displacement. But here, the gerrymandering literature was based on the US, but it spread all over the world from India to France, and we can see different influences on different contexts. Here, we should note that legislation, I mean that electoral system also, and the contextual framework are both play quite significant roles on the effectiveness and outcomes of the gerrymandering practices. When we turn back to Turkey, we can see that Turkish gerrymandering experiences is a bit far beyond the standard recipe. In the Turkish case, we add a bit clientelism and populism to the recipe and stir it with the gerrymandering attempts, I think. So we can say that the scope of the gerrymandering is a bit expanded in the Turkish case. Even I just focus on the post-1950 period, we can say that the initiatives related to gerrymandering practices started with 1930 mayoral elections, because in that elections only Silifke and Aydın were earned by the Free Republican Party, but the provincial status of Silifke turned to town, and it was linked to Mersin, İçel, at that time as a kind of punishment after the election. So in Turkey, we can see that we have pre and post-election strategies in terms of gerrymandering as well. When we look at the Turkish literature, to a large extent, we see the Kırşehir exam very well. Many scholars really dwelt on that issue, and I don't want to go into detail related to Kırşehir example, but for instance, I just want to take your attention to the opposition leaders' hometowns, election districts as well. For instance, Democrat Party in the simple majority system degraded the status I just want to say that splitted Adıyaman from Malatya. Malatya was the electoral district of İnönü, the opposition leader, and just created a new city from Malatya, and Adıyaman became another new city in that process. Similarly, Zonguldak was the electoral district of Ecevit, and also Bartın was spreaded from that city as a kind of punishment, as a kind of minimization process of that opposition leaders' electoral districts. And also we can see that especially after the 1980s, after the introduction of proportional representation system, DONT system with 10% national threshold, we can see that gerrymanders to a large extent focus on local elections in order to gain profit from the local elections, mayoral elections, I mean. In that regard, we can see that upgrading the city status to metropolitans and increasing the number of metropolitan cities and creating new cities such as Kırıkkale, Aksaray, and such, and promoting the cities if they vote for the governing party, as we can see in the Yalova example in 1994, I think, which was promoted by Tanju. And such kind of practices, to a large extent, instrumentalized by the ruling parties in order to gain benefit from the electoral processes. But we cannot say that gerrymandering by itself is not a kind of sufficient instrument to get expected results in the Turkish process. For instance, sometimes the gerrymandering processes can exacerbate the polarization, and especially the partisan gerrymanderers, as we see in the Kırşehir example, to a large extent are punished by the electorates. So we can also talk about 2014 case as a kind of gerrymandering process as well. You know that by law number 6360, the Justice and Development Party increased the number of metropoles from 18 to 30, and the borders of those metropoles are quite expanded. For instance, a kind of good comparison between the Evren and Çankaya from the Ankara metropolitan area can be given as a kind of example of gerrymandering, because the value of one vote in Evren is equal to 61 value of votes in Çankaya district, which is a bit imbalanced use of these districts voting potential, I think. So at the end of that process also, which is a recent thing, I think, for the Turkish politics, we can see that the ruling party gained from that process. For instance, if the local elections were based on the previous rules, the voting party could win Mardin and Van, whilst they would lose Ankara and Antalya, but then the gerrymandering process a bit worked for the favor of the ruling party. All in all, what I observed throughout these gerrymandering processes was that gerrymandering processes in Turkey goes hand in hand with the clientelistic and populist approaches of politics, but the gerrymanders could not get enduring results in the following elections. Maybe for one term or two terms they can gain, but they couldn't get a kind of long-term outcomes, maybe because of the volatility of the election system. We can explain it with this, but gerrymandering didn't provide long or enduring results in the Turkish case, as far as I observed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gülsen. I found this chapter especially very interesting. The others are also interesting, but this gerrymandering, like as a way of manipulating the electoral districts and zones and to create like unfair advantage. In Turkish, I think it's called strategic taksimat. I don't know whether it matches or not, but people call it like that.
It is a complimentary way of saying that. I think it's a very complimentary way.
Yeah, they call it strategic taksimat. It's very like old terminology in Turkish, but this is a very interesting area, I think, in which many similar research and wider research could be done. That is my personal thought, and thank you. And now we move on to the fourth chapter, written by Professors Tanju, Tosun, Gülgün, Tosun, and Betül, Aydoğan, Ünal, on the dynamics of change and differentiation in voter preferences in the western coastal provinces of Turkey since the 1980s. This is more like a regional analysis. And Betül, Aydoğan, Ünal from Ege University, Department of International Relations, will present the chapter. You have the floor, Betül.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Betül Aydoğan Ünal from Ege University, and I am co-author of the chapter 4 with Professor Tanju Tosun and Professor Gülgün Tosun. I want to thank them and also all the authors and editorial team. I know this is so much work, and thank you for taking me on board. Our chapter is mainly about tracing the changes in the voter preferences at the West Coast provinces of Turkey since the 1980s and how they change according to certain political and sociological dynamics. The chapter follows this outline. First, how spatially different is this region? And then we talk about political and sociological elements underlying this with respect to electoral election results. And finally, what are the socioeconomic and political developments that determine voter preferences in this region? First of all, the Western coastal region, there are 12 cities, but these provinces uphold 20% of total voters. So it is important to understand the general trends here. When we look at the electoral map of Turkey, I think it's so much clear that there is a spatial differentiation over voter preferences. And anyone can tell easily that there are three main groupings over Turkey: the center left at the western coast, the conservative masses in the central, eastern, and northern Anatolia, and the pro-Kurdish voters in the southeast. We can say that this trend has started in the 80s, but it has started to become more apparent by the 2002 elections, and it settled by the 2011 elections. This differentiation not only represents itself on the voter preferences, but also it reflects itself on different socioeconomic profiles. One striking fact about the West Coast provinces is that AKP has been performing below its average at the country level, and CHP is performing much better than its country average. So we see the opposite of the national trends here. We check the election results since the 80s closely. This region has higher volatility like the rest of the country. We witnessed dissolvents of many main parties during this time of period, both on the center-right and center-left. People had to change their preferences according to available choices, of course. The main impact on the center-left has come from the dissolvement of the Democratic Left Party in the 2000s. Actually, people didn't change their ideological stance much, and they mostly stayed in the center-left, and they preferred CHP. And this explains actually the rise of the CHP in the region in the last 2 decades. But we have to say that the total votes of the center-left in this area is around 40%. It doesn't change too much. So either with the Democratic Left Party or just CHP, the total amount of votes on the center left doesn't change. So this explains why CHP in the recent years cannot increase its support in the region as much as AKP or MHP does, because center left has, it seems like it has reached its natural limits. On the center right, we see the dissolvement of True Path Party and Motherland Party, and we see that the voters chose AKP or MHP, and the number of the voters choosing these parties are actually increasing rapidly. This means that these parties are gaining more support from this region, but still CHP is much more stronger in this region when compared to the rest of the Turkey. Why this happens so is one of the questions we want to answer in this chapter. Of course, the roots can be found in the late Ottoman era, like center-periphery divide that can explain to some extent. Since the 2080s, actually, there has been a huge migration to this region with the, as you know, the neoliberal policies. And it was a huge flow, but coming people didn't completely adapt themselves with the modern life, I mean, the industrial life. So the battle between values continued within the cities. I mean, since then we are talking about center and periphery, but not as a geographic representation. We are talking about the battle within the cities. And with the support of the periphery, we see the rising support for the pro-Islamist parties from this region, although these cities are more industrialized than the rest of the country. As Ersin Kalaycıoğlu refers this as Kulturkampf between the secularists and religious conservatives. Especially 2011 elections, the ruling party has been using a polarizing language, and that separates, or we can say, makes the differences between these two camps more visible. Mike Wuthrich notes that in Turkey, center-left parties represent the center and right-wing parties represent the periphery. As we said, this region has the highest average scores in the socioeconomic rankings. It is more industrialized. It has higher educational and income levels. And as a result, it has more Western understanding of life. I mean, Western-oriented lifestyle, we can say. And also, it is more heterogeneous with respect to cultural practices. And according to surveys, 1/3 of this population living in this region define themselves as modern, but the rest define themselves as either conservative. Mostly they define themselves as traditionally conservative. So the higher levels of education and income and cultural diversity in this region are mostly associated with the values represented by CHP. So we see high levels of support for this party from relatively better educated, middle and upper income groups with Western lifestyle. On the other hand, recent election results indicate that AKP and MHP, they're rising in the region by mostly getting votes of center-right votes from conservatives. Thank you for listening. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Betül, for the presentation.
Thank you.
Now we move to another presentation by Hüseyin Alptekin. Hüseyin is from Demirkol University, Department of Political Science, and he will focus on the regional and national campaign discourse of the People's Democratic Party and its predecessors in Turkey's general elections. You have the floor, Hüseyin.
Thank you, Dr. Ünay. And I also want to thank our distinguished editors for enabling me to write this chapter and for letting me be in this very valuable book. In this chapter, I focus on one single party, the HDP, Halkların Demokratik Partisi. And what I try to do in the chapter is to compare the electoral discourse of the party on two axes. One is the overtime variation of the discourse, and the other one is more spatial, more geographical variation of the discourse. And in this chapter, what I try to get the information from is it's mostly the electoral statements of the party, plus some other inputs, such as the electoral march, the electoral song of the party, or even the writings, even the certain brands and titles which were exhibited in the party's rallies. But of course, there are some limitations for this research. For one thing, since I start from 2002, these are the years when we did not have, or at least did not use social media effectively. And for that matter, I had to rely on mostly the newspapers and their reporting. And of course, there might be some selection bias there on the reporting of the newspapers. But still, based on this piece of information, I tried to show this variation in a systematic way. When we see the starting point of 2002 elections, when the party was not called HDP at the time, but DEHAP, Democratic Halk Partisi, that was the first election I took. What we see there is more like a class-based, a traditional Marxist party at the national level, talking more about the workers' rights and more about the revolutionary language, a class-based revolutionary language at the national level. But on the local level, the emphasis was way more about the sufferings and pains of the Kurdish people in Southeast Anatolia, in southeastern districts. And especially the electoral march that I quoted from those years show that the emphasis was really on the unsolved murders and the torture and all these bitter memories of the 90s. But even there, in these 2002 elections, there was a connection between this traditional Marxist tone at the national scale and more purely ethnic orientation at the regional level. The connection was as follows. In that particular election, even these Kurdish voters in Southeast District, they were the people, the underclass. They were the people who were exploited by the dominant forces of the market. And even there were some references to the Gramscian understanding of the false consciousness, in the sense that there were those Kurds who saw where their true interest lies and followed that goal, and those other Kurds which were under false consciousness, which picked the wrong parties to vote. And even that ethnic rhetoric was similar to that class-based language. But of course, I will not go through election by election here in this very brief presentation. That was just the groundwork, the 2002 elections. But I want to tell briefly the changes in these two axes, one over time and the other one spatial. What we see there at the national scale, the tone shifted from a more traditional Marxist language to a more new leftist language, which was accompanied by the shift of Öcalan's writings itself, to borrow from the American philosopher Murray Bookchin, to a more ecological leftism, to a more ecological socialism. This new leftist tones, even to some extent shifting toward anarchism. That kind of philosophical rhetoric was parallel to this shift in the HDP's discourse. At the regional level, what we saw was, again, a mostly purely ethnic language based on the dichotomy of the Kurdish people versus the Turkish state. But there also we saw a shift. And here the shift was not linear. It was different from the linear shift in the national scale toward the new leftist tone. At the regional tone, what we saw was a parenthesis where religion became really important for a while, especially in the 2007 and 11 elections, in these two respective elections. What happened before and after this religion opening was that before the 2007 elections, the approach of the party or the movement towards religion was under the influence of this traditional Marxism. It was very secular and to some extent quite anti-religious establishment tone. But then we saw the opening toward the religion, both in the discourse of the electoral statements, but also in the candidate profiles. The people who were known as the Islamist figures in Turkey, but particularly amongst the Kurdish population, they were picked by the party as the candidates for the parliamentary elections. But the Syrian civil war changed this religious opening of the party, especially after the events in Kobani, after the siege of Kobani in late 2014. The party turned to a more hostile view of the traditional Islamic viewpoint, which at times focused solely on ISIS, but at times saw some parallels between the AK Party's position in Turkey and ISIS in Syria. To some extent, the party saw and showed ISIS as a project of Turkey, especially in its campaigns in southeastern Turkey. That was the closure of the religious opening, starting with the 2015 elections. Of course, there are lots of things to talk about each of these elections, but these were the main trends. But one other limitation before concluding my section was that the party is difficult to study. It has some unique characteristics because the party couldn't survive over elections. The party faced multiple constitutional court cases, sometimes was banned by the court, so had to rebrand itself, but sometimes rebranded itself without any constitutional court case, like 2015 elections. It came with a new brand, HDP. Plus, the party also at certain times ran with different names in different parts of the country. Plus, in certain elections, the party ran with independent candidates, not under the umbrella of a single party mechanism, but with a block of independent candidates, just to get around the 10% electoral threshold in the parliament. But despite these difficulties to trace the change in the party's discourse, I believe the rise of neo-leftist turn was the biggest change in the party, but also in parallel to this, the party's main negative rhetoric changed toward the Turkish state's atrocities in the 90s toward Erdoğan. Erdoğan became the symbol of these hostile memories that stayed in the 90s. And now the party's rising discourse turned to Erdoğan's turn toward nationalism, AK Party's merger with the MHP, and getting back to old Turkey. This is the main rhetoric of the party in its discourse. And thank you all for your consideration and your attention.
Well, I think we can go on, right? Perhaps Sadık Hoca has not heard you stop.
I think I was too boring for Sadık Hoca. He just laughed.
Nah, nah. Okay, I think we have Selin and Kürşat, the next chapter, right? Gender orientation of political geography. So I think Selin will talk, right?
Bahsettiniz ya. Yarın devam ederiz.
Okay, your moderator is back. Sorry, I'm here. I think we are finished with Hüseyin. We are continuing with Selin. Where are they doing politics, women cooperatives as sites of constellations of power, an analysis on the gender aspect. Okay.
Thank you very much. On behalf of myself and my co-author Kürşat, I would like to thank you all for this opportunity. I would like to thank the organizer and also the editors and the contributors as well. It's a pleasure to be here today. And before I start to briefly summarize our chapter, unfortunately, I have to leave immediately after I make my presentation because I have a doctor appointment that I couldn't reschedule because my doctor's very busy schedule. I'm very sorry. I was looking forward to hear Hasretli Bilgin's comments, but Kürşat will be here and I'm sure he will pass what Hasret will share with us. Well, in our research, in our chapter, we have shifted the focus of the research on political geography. It's not a research on political parties per se, rather we have analyzed the different scales and the women's empowerment and the way they conduct politics. First, I have to mention at the very beginning that this is a part of a Marie Curie grant supervised by my co-author, Dr. Kürşat Çınar, and Dr. Çınar's project, the umbrella project of his Marie Curie project, aimed to analyze female empowerment with its multifaceted aspect. And as a part of this research, me, myself, Kürşat Çınar, Meral Uğur Çınar, and Emine Öncüler Yayalar, we did a fieldwork and we conducted in-depth interviews with members of women cooperatives throughout Turkey. And our bigger aim was to understand different experiences of women and also to examine, to analyze the conditions that support or prevent or hinder women's empowerment. And at the end of our fieldwork, we did different things. We had different outputs and articles. Some of the articles were also published in different journals. And another output is this very specific chapter. As our data was very comprehensive, it enabled us to reread these experiences, these narratives of women with different focuses. And this book chapter is mainly focusing on geographies of doing politics. Where are they doing politics? Where is the politics is located? Where is the political is located? Yes, doing politics is a very contested term, and the practices within the act of politics have been evaluated by researchers, scholars for so many years so far, and the scholars from different disciplines as well. For us, for me and for Kürşat, what is critical was to analyze the practices and the discourses that were circulated across multiple scales. And here as well, the literature also urges us to remember that the politics and the political is not located in specific institutions, like political parties, like other institutions. Here, the boundaries are blurred, and there are multifaceted dimensions of networks, institutions, groups, etc. So we decided to go beyond these fixed boundaries, especially the public and private boundaries. And we decided to question the alternative sites for women's participation in local politics and the ways these women practice doing politics. And here, at this point, women's cooperatives provided a very fertile ground for us to analyze their engagement, this women's engagement with local authorities as both recipient and provider. And feminist political geography in general, electoral geography in particular, interpreted these sites, these alternative sites, and analyzes how women specialize these different forms of being political. Our research questions were mainly on evolving around the questions of how do the members of cooperatives negotiate with local actors, especially the encounters of the women with the local actors like the governance, the mayors, and the other members of the political parties in their cities for sure. And also the follow-up question was, how do party support and political capital interact to gain salience? So by analyzing these alternative venues as spaces of doing politics, conducting politics, this work, we argue, makes a very humble contribution to the field of women empowerment, and most specifically, the intersections of spaces, the encounters of women, and empowerment practices by mapping these gendered bases of geographies of party support in Turkey. And to do so, for this rationale, to follow this rationale, we integrated our feminist lens into the analysis of different political scales. What we have found, actually, let me be it very clear here because I want to be like a trailer, and I really kindly ask you to buy the book, to have the book and read the chapter. So I'm not going to share more, but very briefly, women's cooperatives are very unique organizations, thanks to their economic as well as social targets. Why do we call them as social targets? Because women's cooperatives works as places, sites for attaining equality, having some social progress, while also preserving an horizontal and non-hierarchical organizational structure. Of course, thanks to these women's cooperatives, women make money. They earn some money because they sell some stuff and they do some money, they earn some money. But for us, the other dimension, the other side of the coin, we argue that these cooperatives have also other functions that are not limited only to economic ones. Especially, they are important in the creation and expansion of the spatial construction of politics, not only at individual level, but also at group levels. Because in these cooperatives, women are mostly acting together. And we conducted 23 representatives of women's cooperatives in Turkey from different cities, from different regions. And this number, the number of 23 corresponds nearly half of the active cooperatives in Turkey back in 2018. And reading the different spatial arrangements disclosed women's role in distributional networks of politics as very active agents of it. And for us, we argue that cooperatives work as topographies of a woman, or for women, for channeling their voices, for telling their needs and aspirations, for sorting things out, for making things work. And these women that we have interviewed are very esteemed participants, shared their stories, shared their experiences with us. And we may argue that they very well maneuvered between being client of the services that they offer and also the pattern of the whole process of this giving and taking. So here, the patron-client relationship and the literature also helped us to widen our lens. And when integrating the role of the party support, especially in the form of very close relationship with the actors, here, as I mentioned, the actors might be either the mayor or the governor or the other members of the neighborhood, the city, or the other local notables as well. It well disclosed, such rereading well disclosed the both horizontal and vertical networks. So thanks to our feminist lens, we revealed the very blurred and also overlapped spaces of doing politics. And I hope you will be enjoying reading this chapter. Thank you very much.
Okay, I thank Dr. Selin Akyüz from TED University for this wonderful presentation on the role of women and gender issues and women cooperatives in terms of electoral geography and the functions of political parties. Now we move on to Ayşenur Kılıç, and she will be talking about election monitoring organizations in view of electoral geography, another study on electoral geography, regional characteristics of volunteer networks in Turkey. The floor is yours, Ayşenur.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, let me first thank their editors and anonymous reviewers of the book, and also to Professor Wuthrich for his constructive comments and introduction to the book. I must also thank the cats, which were accused of being in the electric substation on the elections day and caused countrywide power cuts, and which aroused also my curiosity further in this topic. Other than the cats, I'm interested in this topic mainly because electoral integrity and monitoring is quite a nascent sphere within Turkish politics. And I think the significance of this issue seems to endure in the near future as well. In this chapter, I examined the first two domestic election monitoring organizations in Turkey. Both were founded in 2014 following the famous Gezi Park protests and at the crossroads of some other political events, new regulations, electoral regulations, and discussions related to the electoral integrity in the country. So as the research question in this study, I mainly ask how the two electoral monitoring organizations' volunteer networks represent the regional characteristics of the electoral geography, the trio of the country, as Edip Hoca indicated in the electoral map. The results revealed that despite their claims to neutrality, non-partisanship, and being above politics, these organizations tend to mirror the political culture and the voting behavioral characteristics of the secular coastal areas in the West at the expense of the southeastern Kurdish and conservative nationalistic central areas. In terms of the groups of variables, I focused on volunteer networks' organizational characteristics, their media preferences, trust, and political identity, basically. By interviewing and survey techniques in this study, I measured media use, such as the news preferences, media literacy, and to a limited extent, though, fact-checking behaviors. I also measured trust in different forms, trust in news media, trust in election results, and trust in democracy in Turkey. I also measured voluntary networking behaviors and characteristics, such as the length of voluntary activity or the rationale behind the first involvement with the voluntary activity, the democratic participation behaviors, etc. I also focused on information channels in voluntary networking and the perceived political identity of the informants, neighbors, families, and friends, their social environment. In terms of some basic findings, first of all, the survey sample projected clear characteristics predominantly associated with one of the three regions of Turkey's electoral map, that is the, as mentioned earlier, the Western Coastal Secular region. Secondly, there is a negative correlation between trust in election results and the desire for monitoring elections. Lower trust pushes the citizens, the volunteers, to monitor elections more. The data identifies a considerable correlation between the level of distrust in elections and the level of distrust in the news. Both levels of distrust were found to be high among the volunteers. Another finding is that the volunteers of both groups reported considerably lower satisfaction with the functioning of democracy in the country. High number of voters considered that Atatürkism and secularism as the identity best representative of themselves. In terms of political spectrum, both voluntary groups chiefly locate themselves on the left or central left side. The informants opted for the alternative and oppositional media platforms or newspapers rather than the conventional national news media, or as long as the news media outlets are oppositional in character. I think my study can be considered a pilot study initially that initiates some significant questions for future studies. So it can be taken as a pilot study here. So I think the first consideration for future studies is that which societal groups these kind of democratic demands of civic participation, such as the electoral integrity and screening, comes from initially and why. A second consideration for future studies can be that beside the amount of votes they gain or lose, what can be some other alternative or affirmative functions of even the smallest political parties within the democratic systems, as I initially mentioned in the study in the Liberal Democratic Party case. A third future question with the consideration, collaboration between political parties and election monitoring organization is also nascent in Turkish political sphere, I think. The nature and the future of the communication channels between civic participation actors and the political parties are another field which requires, I think, closer examination. And finally, the acceptance or rejection of independent domestic monitoring organizations by the ruling parties all around the world, not only in Turkey, I think requires particular attention of the researchers for future studies. This is just a brief summary of my main findings and my main considerations for future studies. I think that's all for now. If you have any further questions, I'd gladly answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ayşenur Kılıç from Ankara Social Sciences University. Our next speaker is Dr. Mezher Yüksel from Kırıkkale University, Department of Sociology, and we'll be talking about endangering the parliament, a study of women deputies in Turkey, 1935-2018. The floor is yours.
He couldn't make it.
Really? Okay.
So we can go on with Mezher.
Shall we skip to the next presentation? Okay. Okay, then last but not least, we have my dear colleague Necati Anas from İstanbul University. And he will talk about on the joint article they wrote with Mehmet Köse on the analysis of Turkish overseas electoral districts, opportunities and challenges. Necati, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Ünay. Actually, we decided that my co-author will present the paper, and if there's further questions, I will come to the floor. Back.
Okay, then we listen to Mehmet. You have the floor.
Sorry. I would like to thank our editors, Mr. Edip and Gülsen, for this opportunity to be part of this editing books. And I'm not going to get into details of the article. I'm going to just summarize or give the environment that overseas or external voting system improved and developed. As many think that the external voting, diaspora voting is a recent phenomena, but actually it's been almost a century that the external voting started to be implemented by many countries. At the moment, we have in the world around about 145 countries implementing this external voting system mechanisms. And why are these countries implementing or embracing the practice of external voting? Because of the population and the citizens, keeping their nationality, living outside the country, outside the territory. Some can say that the increase in number of transnational citizens, the increase in number of diasporas, also enforcing governments to be to develop policies to keep their ties with the native motherland or the origin country. In this article, we try to give the perspectives that the people discussing about the diaspora voting, external voting. We also try to give the the basis for Turkish academia and for Turkish politicians, for Turkish public, Turkish audiences, particularly after the discussion and the perception last 5-6 years Turkey is experiencing regarding the external voting that we implement in the last 5 elections. The countries can give this right of the voting for external citizens by for their economic cooperation, for giving the constitutional rights, for giving the response, the capacity of the diasporas, particularly to impress the politics by lobbying. These are the discussions that being in the academia, in the literature. There is also discussion that whether to give the right to vote who is not resident in the country or the person who is not paying the taxes. These are the discussions in the literature. When we check the some literature, what they say, because of the actually the practices, I may say the practices leading the theoretical discussions in this area. For example, when you check the countries who are given the right to vote, you can see the difference. Most countries given the citizens to vote in national elections. So what I mean, national elections is more related with the citizenship. In many countries, constitutions also emphasizing the right to elect or to be elected for every citizen. So these people say that this is constitutional right that you need to provide or give the right to vote for the citizens wherever they are living. Secondly, we see the increasing number of countries giving the right to vote in the local elections who is residing in that local governments without, irrespective of their citizenship, which is also increasing phenomena in many countries in Europe, in Latin America. You can see this, I think, in the Roger Bybeck's study. He worked on 54 or 57 countries in Europe and in Latin America. This is the outcome of this research. So Turkey is not experiencing the citizens living outside. Just in recently, it's been almost a century, more than half a century, and this has been discussed since 1950s. Turkey started to change its legislation to keep up with the developments and changes in the political system, electoral system in the world. As I said, most countries in the world practicing external voting, but also some countries started to give the right to be represented for their diasporas, for their external citizenship, not just because of their economic contribution to the country, but because of the growing number of people voting in diaspora, started to discuss to be represented as they are within their political system, within their capital. And there are countries, from Europe, from Latin America, from Africa, implementing this external representative system, diaspora representation. For example, France is almost the pioneering country of this external representation system. And the Portuguese in 1975 introduced external seats, special quota for their diaspora. And the Romania, Italy, Dominic, Ecuador, Algeria, Tunis, and many countries, Croatia. These countries also started to give the representation for their citizens abroad, diaspora. The motive may be changed, can be changed. Some of them given the right of representation, rewarding to their contribution to the country, or trying to prove that the country is more democratized, like after the revolution in Portuguese, and the regime changes in some countries during the authoritarian era. They expelled a lot of oppositions, and also is kind of repatriating, or given the right to be politically involved in the country while they are residing and living outside the country. So this is the general atmosphere in this in external voting system. When it comes to Turkey, unlike the perception in the public, Turkey has not been discussed this external voting in the last decade or 2 decades. But actually Turkey started to change its legislation 1950s, since 1950s. We can categorize in 3 levels of changes in this legislation. One is in 1950 to add an article into the legislation, electoral legislation, to give the right to be registered when they are living outside, to be registered as a voter, but with the only the condition that to be registered to the place that last lived in the country as a resident. This registration was an issue since 2008. Turkey, there was some changes in the registration of the voters when for overseas residents, but they didn't have. They can only vote when they come to the country during the election time, and also to be registered in the electoral list in 1950s, 61. They had to be in the country as well. In 1973, the country changed a legislation, give the right to be registered by their family members in the country when the census conducted before the electoral process started. And in 1979, that was another changes, but still it wasn't effectively implemented. It didn't effectively implement it. So the second issue, second category we can discuss, that the right to vote outside. That was started to be discussed after just when the Turkish people started to migrate outside, particularly to Germany and Europe in 1960s. The first legislative proposal came in 1965 by Istanbul MP from the CHP, from the Social Democratic Party, to give the right to vote when they are outside. And his argument was these people, like around about 200,000 people living outside the country, and to vote in the country's election is their constitutional right. So we have to pass the legislation to give them this right. Unfortunately,
okay, Dr. Kese, if you can just wrap up so that we can, in a couple of sentences, because we need to have some time for discussion and and the question and answer session, please.
Okay, that discussion started in 1965, but couldn't succeed until 2014, 2012, we can say that. And that some MPs, some part of the political actors tried to bring this legislation in 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. We seen almost 15 or 16 legislative proposals in the Turkish parliament to give this right to to Turkish migrants, Turkish citizens living abroad. In 1987, there was another attempt to give the right to vote, but the voting possibilities at the customs, I can say that it's not to vote abroad, but the voting right for the people who lives abroad. It's not also the solution for the people in diaspora waiting for to get that political rights. We came to in 2012, and the legislation enacted to give the right for external citizens. In 2014, 2015, 2017, and 2018, we've seen 5 elections. The overseas electors voted. There are 3 million people with the right to vote. The last election, almost half of 1.5 million Turkish electors went to the ballot boxes and voted. This is huge number when you compare to diaspora's electoral participation with the other countries, even with Mexico, Brazil, Russia, and other countries. None of them reached to this level in terms of number. Even France, they have 11 MPs. These 11 MPs have been elected by 200,000 voters. And the Turkish electors, Turkish diasporas in the overseas, always demanded to have the right to elect and also to be represented from diaspora. And they do not want someone from Istanbul, from Tokat, or from any other city in Turkey to be elected as the vote by the votes of the people of those cities and represent their rights in Ankara, in the parliament. This is the major discussion, major point raised by many diaspora members. And this being brought up by all the political parties in Turkish parliament, not just in 2020 or 2012. In 1980s, CAP is all the political parties from all the spectrums. They brought this issue into the parliament. The first
Dr. Kese, I know that you have a long bureaucratic career and you are very passionate to talk about it.
We are the last one and we have the
please,
right.
Yeah, please, like 2 or 3 sentences, please wrap up.
Last sentence.
Okay.
In 1998, there was a proposal in the parliament offering to give 10 seats for the Turkish diaspora as well. Now we are at the point Turkey has experienced the last 5 elections. Half of the diaspora electoral members went to the voting ballot boxes. They voted for the national elections, but they don't know how their votes affect their demands. and they don't have any direct representatives in the parliament. And also this was changing the choices of the local electors as well. So in the last elections, 11 MPs exchanged between parties because of the external voters distribution. So this is the critical part as well. You know, thanks to Sadık, Professor Sadık, that he doesn't let me.
Yeah, I'm the bad cop here.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm going to stop here, but I'm ready to discuss.
Okay, thank you. We are grateful. Obviously, Dr. Mehmet Köse is the former chairman of Turkish communities abroad now, which is tied to the presidency. So he has huge diplomatic, bureaucratic experience on these issues. And we are grateful that he was also involved along with our colleague Necati in this book, because he comes from the field. He used to be a practitioner for long years. And I know that this diaspora issue is a critical issue, and electoral involvement of diaspora communities are important, but we are running out of time. So, and I need to give the floor to Professor Hasretikici Bilgin from Bilgi University, and she was patiently waiting for us. Her research interests are comparative government, political parties, elections in Turkey and the Middle East. And she wrote in many international journals, including Parliamentary Affairs, International Political Science Review, and so on and so forth. The list is quite long. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Bilgin. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to review the book. And I have some comments. And I'd like to share something if you want to, I don't know, see better, because in online meetings, it becomes a little bit confusing, if I may. Okay, let me do it like that. Okay, first of all, I think this book is one of the best works on Turkish politics with a terminology that can travel across the comparative politics field and which shows an improvement in the Turkish literature that we no longer the rising academic staff in Turkey, together with the more senior members, are developing a more comparative approach to Turkey. This might be only about Turkey, but as I also noticed in your literature review parts, each and every author is well aware about the international literature. So this is something that's quite new in Turkish politics, something we started to see more after 2000, and it's a great hope for the Turkish academia. And another praise that I have for the book is many books on Turkish politics are on very general terms. Only very recently, those areas which were considered as Turkish exceptionalism started to be recognized as not exceptionalism, but as issues that requires explanation, that requires causal inference. So this book is first in its field because, to the best of my knowledge, other than Sekor, West II, and Çarkoğlu, we have very little studies on the political geography of elections. So many of the things that I read in this book are initial studies. So whatever I will say, all my comments are not criticisms. Please take these as constructive feedback, because if any of you would like to go on working on these fields, and also based on our informed guests from the international literature, that many aspects that I am talking about will come up. So these are just feedbacks, not criticisms. So here I go. Okay, my first point is, you take the year 2000 in the initial chapter as the beginning of the regionalization. But here I have two reservations. First of all, yes, you're right that the origins of regionalization might be in the politics of 1950s, but can we say so? Because there were only two major parties in the period from 1950 to 1960. So they had to be regionalized. When we look at 1960s, we actually see a pattern of regionalization, especially in the local elections. In 1963 local elections, it's very clear that West and North went to Adalet Partisi, and Center and East was left in the hands of CHP. In 1969 national elections and 1965 national elections, it is possible to observe some regionalization patterns. So my hunch is that, as you mentioned at several places in the book, polarization might have an impact on increased nationalization, increased party nationalization, but also increased regionalization. Because it drives the people to towards strategic voting. Rather than the first choices, the choice that will defeat the enemy party becomes more important during the polarization, high polarization periods. The similarity between the 2000s and 1960s might stem from that point. But that is my initial observation on the issue. You mentioned several times, and this is a very important point that needs further exploration. What brings the changes in regional voting behaviors? How, for example, the regions with an overwhelmingly Kurdish population started to vote from CHP to the other parties. And I'm not only talking about the pro-Kurdish parties, but the Islamist parties as well. Or Izmir, the first contestant of CHP or Western Coast, voting for the First Democrat Party, then Adalet Partisi, then became the stronghold of CHP. How do we explain that? Should we take into account the incumbency factor, that the places with high educational level tend to be more in opposition? So as the incumbents change, as the main opposition changes, does it lead to a change in their voting behaviors? In general, my main, how can I say, less explored issues across the book is about the impact of voter turnout, because at many places I will also ask this to the individual authors, that when you take the voter turnout, whether it's low or high, and who went to the ballot box, who remained at home, the picture might be quite different. One of the things that brought Ekrem İmamoğlu to the Istanbul municipality was the fact that many conservative voters did not go to the ballot box in the second municipality election. So how does voter turnout, its lack thereof or its high levels, and who could mobilize their voters better than the others, impact all these electoral geography issues? Again, in terms of space is something that's recently started to be explored in the Turkish politics, and it's very important. But looking at space in itself provides limited explanation. But looking at spatial class space and class interactions might help us put light on the issues that can be explained further. And again, as you also mentioned in your chapters, when you look at the local behavior, it says something else when you look at the national behavior. Which one should we be focusing on in general in the electoral geography studies? Okay. About regionalization, my final question, my final issue: does migration change voting behaviors? A person from Trabzon, if moves to CHP or Bartın, after 2 generations, 3 generations, do they change their voting behavior? Because if the region is an independent variable and works when controlled for all other variables, then we should also have the answer to this question. The others are there. Okay. Should I ask questions to the individual chapter authors one by one and get the answers, or should I just fire my questions all together in one breath? I am a nerd. I read every line of the book.
Yeah, I think if you ask all your questions all together, then everyone who would like to answer can talk a little bit after you.
Okay, the questions might already be answered, but I still ask these questions because it's not emphasized or it's not clear to me. So if I skipped something, I apologize in advance. About the nationalization chapter, this is the point that I raised already. At some point, you write that after the 2000 CHPs, for example, nationalization score drops. Did you control for the voter turnout levels? Because we know that until 2015 June elections, and more so after the referendum, CHP started to better mobilize its electoral stronghold. But before that, many people would have, who would have voted for CHP didn't go to the ballot box. So to what extent the voter turnout might be a factor that explains, that provides partial explanation to the current mid-level of nationalization in Turkey. About the gerrymandering article to Gülsen Hocam, all chapters are brilliant. Yours is very brilliant. You particularly give a detailed account of the period before 2000, but we see that the part about the 2000s, what happened in the last 20 years, have limited analysis. So I would have liked to, because you analyzed the previous parts in very good, considerable detail, and I would have liked to see more about the impact of the gerrymandering actions, activities, attempts in the last 20 years. And for example, you say that it led to strategic thinking by the voters, but and they voted for MHP so that AKP could not win. But now that AKP allies with MHP, will they go to the ballot box ever? How will this affect gerrymandering as in terms of its repercussions? Or they will simply vote for the opposition parties? What's your expectation? And about the entire organization of the chapter, you already clearly state that the electoral system is an important determinant, and I agree with you. But this means that the electoral engineering, when an election is made with a majoritarian formula, will be more concerned about gerrymandering in terms of electoral engineering stuff, but in terms of proportional representation, we should have been looking at deliberate malapportionment. So if you also take it into account, I think this might improve this might bring more contributions to our theoretical and empirical accumulation of knowledge. About the Western Coast chapters, to Betül Hocam and Tosun Hocas. So this is a clear spatial analysis. And it's very interesting to see the change across time. But again, if we cross this with class, low-income migrant workers, what kind of changes do we see in terms of their voting behaviors? HDP article, Hüseyin Alptekin Hocam, it is very clear, and you clearly established that the party discourse is moving towards a socialist one to a new left one. But what we see is that an important portion of the HDP electorate is highly religious. And from the analysis of the elections, we know that Islamist parties has had an appeal since the 1970s. So we know that when there is a situation in which there is a rapprochement between the state and the separatist movement, or when there are efforts of de-radicalization on behalf of the government, or a more inclusive discourse from a non-pro-Kurdish party, we see that the electoral is willing to vote for parties other than the pro-Kurdish parties. But still, the discourse remains around at the left-hand side of the political spectrum. How do we explain that? Selin and Kürşat hocam, I think this is a quite beautiful precursor to Selin's other articles, Married to the Anatolian Tigers. If she had the opportunity to stay, I would have praised that article as well. It was published in Turkish Studies in 2019 with Dilek Cindoğlu, Feyda Sayan, and one other person that I don't understand, remember right now. I apologize for that.
Aslı Çırakman hocam.
Aslı Çırakman, yes, thank you. This group is very competent in using the feminist methodology to understand the change in the Turkish politics. And here in this chapter, we see that they underscore the fact that the patriarchal domination continue in the women's cooperatives. To what extent do we explain this with the Islamization of capital and the rise of the Islamic capital as a distinct capital fraction? To Ayşenur Kılıç hocam, it was very interesting to read the electoral monitoring organizations from your pen, and it was also nostalgic for me because I worked as a volunteer for the Vote and Beyond for a long time. Yeah, you say that it's mostly the opposition people, and you contrast this with the international trends. You give an example from Venezuela, and I can add an example from Mexico, that sometimes the incumbents might be eager to create electoral monitoring organizations to increase their legitimation or to manipulate the process through the EMOs. It might be either way, but in Turkey, this is mostly as an opposition organization, and this is natural because, I mean, why would the incumbents be scared of their vote stolen as they are in control? And it is also natural that the main opposition, which is moderate in the Turkish oppositional landscape compared to the other oppositional groups, it's natural that they will take the lead because it's political cost. They are being branded as terrorists, etc., will be lower. But I think there's something else that we should analyze there. You already say that Liberal Democratic Party provided more than 30,000 supervisor badges to the people. And it was partly because, yes, the AKP and MHP declined to give any access cards to the Vote and Beyond. And also because CHP, as I worked in that process, CHP tried to issue other parties access cards, because, you know, when one of the members of the board in every ballot box doesn't come, anyone from the audience can nominate themselves for being a member of the ballot box board. Sandık kurulu üyesi. So as CHP already has a board member almost always, they prefer that Vote and Beyond members use other parties' cards so that they will have a higher chance to be monitoring as part of the board. And I personally observed that many HDP members did not use their cards because just before, for example, the 2015 June or November election, there was a raid to the HDP offices. So they were there, but they kept a low profile and they used other parties. You will not believe, but I remember issuing Vatan Partisi cards to many HDP people. How can we control for these factors that using other parties' cards, trying to keep low profile deliberately? How can we control for these dynamics to provide explanations? Yüksel Hocam, about the representation of women in the Turkish parliament. We see that the women played a very important role in the Islamist movement in Turkey. And they made lots of sacrifices, especially during the headscarf struggle period, February 28th. They were more courageous than the men. And they took the hardest hit because it was them who were ousted from the universities, from the public institutions, harassed on the streets. But then we see that after a brief period, the tendency to put representatives dropped even for AKP. We see an opposite trend in Ennahda. They value high number of having the party with the highest number of female representatives as an issue of as a token of their goodwill to integrate into the political system. Why do you think this comparison gives a different outcome in the Turkish case? Is it the incumbency factor, or is it an ideological issue on behalf of AKP, as it didn't pursue a political rebranding? It left this female issue to work in a different way. And finally, Hüseyin Anaz and Mehmet Köse Hocam, this diaspora constituency issues is very important, and we are discussing it, to what extent it impacts the Turkey, but the other countries are also discussing it. You may have remembered that after the last election, in Belgium, in Austria, in Germany, I'm pretty sure that you are aware, as you have been also on the field, that they discussed preventing this. Do you think this is possible? And my second question is, many of the countries are pressing for a termination of the double citizenship. So do you think voters of the diaspora will be still important to an extent that can change the electoral outcome in Turkey? Or do you think this will disappear as an issue? Thank you for putting up with my speedy talk, but I thought that it took a lot of time, and I don't want to take more of your time.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the thorough discussion on the chapters. If Edip agrees, I would like to go by the order that we started and give maybe 2 or 3 minutes to each speaker, I mean, to respond to the discussion and the points raised by Professor Bilgin. Then we will wrap up the session, maybe giving the floor to Edip and at the end to Michael. That's okay, Edip?
May I turn off my video so that I can hear you more clearly?
Of course, feel free. Okay, so Özhan, would you like to say anything? This could be a response to the discussion, to the points raised by the discussant, or anything that you want to add.
In fact, I want to answer this question. We used an Excel template to calculate the standardized party nationalization scores. May I show it just here? It was something like that. And it was shared in internet, but now I can't find it. So I just looked it. As you can see, here, there's no any column for this voter turnout rate. We here write this, the number of valid votes, they are all written in number, not in percentages. And here the parties' names, and they here vote in numbers again. But this Excel template was prepared by Boschler to measure party nationalization, and he used gender-based indicator. But unfortunately, it didn't take the voter turnout into account. So in your criticism, you're right. And I had never thought about that to be honest. And that's all that I will say.
Okay, thank you. So, so the discussion was useful. Now we move to Gülsen. Gülsen Kaya Osmanbaşoğlu, your response, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your compliments and for your bright comments that really very valuable for all of us. And for my chapter, I have two reasons for that. First of all, the format of Routledge to a large extent tired us as much as academic load, and we just needed to shorten our chapters, and all of our participants, except mostly focused on 2000s. For that reason, I just shortened that part a bit. But I have another reason for this question also. Especially the promotion and downgrading of the provinces was the very basic instrument for gerrymanderers. And when we look at the Turkish map, Turkey's map, we can see that the last province is Düzce, which was founded in 1999, as far as I remember. So till 2014, we do not observe a very apparent gerrymandering processes in the ways that we observed in 2014 or in the DP period and such. So first of all, I just shortened the post-2014 process because I just focus on the status of villages and so on, but I just skip these parts. But Hasret Hoca''s valuable comments are really enrich my views on that issue. I will think about it, and maybe I will publish another article in that regard. Thank you very much. And I'm grateful to receive your comments as well. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gülsen. Probably these discussions will stimulate new research and writings in the future. And now we move to Betül. Betül Aydoğan, would you like to respond as well?
Yes, please. First, I want to thank Professor Dikici Bilgin for her valuable comments and for reading the whole book line by line. Thank you for that. Actually, the question was how people coming from low income, they are migrants, who they are voting for. Actually, we don't have that information. We don't have that data, because for that, to answer this question, we need individual level data, but all we have is aggregate level election results. So if you make any inference from the aggregate level data, we will be actually committing ecological fallacy. But we need survey data, or we need some kind of individual data about those migrant people. But our intuition and the correlation between the voting groups can tell something about this. And we see that as the number of the migrants increase in the population, we see that the votes of the central right is increasing, not the central left. So we cannot say that the newcomers and low-income people are voting for the central left. Instead, we can say that they are actually preferring central right or right-wing parties, or more nationalist parties like MHP. Other than that, actually, it calls for new research, and thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Betül.
Thank you.
Now we move on to Hüseyin, Alptekin. Dr. Alptekin, your responses, please.
I also thank Hasret Hoca for her valuable comments and her question. Yes, the HDP and its predecessors, they all embraced a secular and leftist tone in their campaign discourses, which might be not very appropriate, given that the Kurdish population in Turkey, they tend to be more conservative compared to the rest of the country in a number of survey research and also in non-survey indicators. But why does the HDP do that, and how come they still get quite a lot of support in the region? That's an important question, I believe. And I think the first half of this question is about the HDP's ideological characteristic. HDP is not a catch-all party. They have this very ideological core, and I think they will not shift it to this centrist and very catch-all party design. But still they get votes. But again, I don't think we should exaggerate the HDP's voter basis in Turkey's Kurdish population. I think based on number of calculations, we can see that HDP is getting half of the population support in Southeast Turkey, and its primary competitor is the AK Party. And I think the primary line of division is there, not so much about ethnic characteristics of the campaign, but more about this secular versus conservative approach. And I still believe that the conservative Kurdish voters tend to vote for the AK Party, despite some contrary arguments in more recent years.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Alptekin. I think Dr. Selin Akyüz just departed the meeting, so we move to Dr. Ayşenur Kılıç.
I can go ahead, Sadık Hocam.
Pardon?
We have Kürşat Hocam.
Kürşat is here. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Thank
Kürşat,
you.
would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Sadık Hocam. And I also would like to thank Hasret Hoca and Mike Hoca for their encouraging and illuminating comments. And also I'd like to thank our editors here, Gülsen Hoca and Edip Hoca, and also our contributors for their efforts. Regarding Hasret Hoca's question about Islamization of capital, I can, of course, give you a brief answer, and I will say significantly in many localities based on our fieldwork. And I can say that it affects not only the markets that the women's cooperatives operate, but more importantly, the political landscape, the political system, political mechanisms, both at the national and also at the local level that we're trying to analyze here in our chapter, including the patron-client relationships. Including the patron-client relationships that we aim to cover in our chapter. And regarding the particular impact of the Islamization of capital and the relevant links to the increased patriarchal discourse and its impact on women's empowerment, we have two upcoming articles. One in social politics and one will hopefully appear in gender work and organization. And for those of you interested in this area, I will be really glad to share these line of research too. Thank you very much, by the way, everyone.
Thank you very much, Kürşat. Now we move to Ayşenur Kılıç. Ayşenur, would you like to respond?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Professor Dikici Bilgin, for your very nice, detailed, closer examination and comments. Actually, I was sharing most of your concerns and comments when I first searched about this topic, but after a while, I realized that, yeah, we can explain your questions and concerns through many different factors. First, I mean, to start with, in terms of the relationship between incumbents or the ruling party and these electoral monitoring organizations, domestic ones, I'm not sure whether this relations is so natural, or the relationship between oppositional parties and the electoral monitoring organizations is so natural. I'm not sure about that, because when we dig into further to this issue, we see that up to 2018, in this 4-year time period, even the main opposition party, RPP, did not pay attention to these electoral monitoring organizations in a systematic way, though, even though they provided some badges, etc., but they did not pay enough attention. Again, about the same topic, when we look at the Chernik and Svolik's book, they argue that the relationship between a ruling party and this monitoring organization, on the side of the ruling party, it might have a strong incentive to support this impartial third parties, either in the form of monitoring organization or other independent organizations, such as these electoral observers, in order to foreclose the possibility of post-election violence when it estimates that an impending election will be a close one. So even on the side of the ruling party, giving support for this kind of independent observers might be their own benefits. So besides advancing electoral integrity, advancing electoral integrity may not be the only motivation for political parties, I think, to support. As you said, and as I mentioned in the article, Venezuelan case or the Mexican case of Alianza Cívica can be some refuting examples for this argument. But other than those, I agree with you in the sense of the limitedness in terms of the number and the scope of my survey sample, but it is the natural outcome that I conducted my fieldwork in the state of emergency atmosphere. And in addition to that, concurrently with my start of this fieldwork, there were this sudden announcement of snap elections in 2018. So naturally, people were reluctant. Also these electoral observers and these volunteers were reluctant to talk and give some details, because concurrently with this study, they were being accused of spies, fifth column, etc., etc. So I could understand that they can be unwilling to speak more. So this can be also because of the limitedness of my sample size. So future studies might develop and make a full-fledged study in terms of the number. That is why I called it a pilot study with this regards. Let me check. Also, Toros and Birch recently talked about this discursive manipulation. So when we consider this recent article, we can understand that the relationship between these kind of organizations and incumbent parties or the opposition parties, it can be so natural, their relations, because discursive manipulation can be used by both ruling parties or oppositional parties. So when we consider all of these, we might have a better explanation, but I strongly agree with your comments in the sense that this can only be a pilot starting point for future studies. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ayşenur. And we move to the writers of the last piece, and probably Necati might respond.
Yes, I'm going to try. Yes, okay.
To the discussion. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hasret Hocam. These are the great points. I would like to say a few things. I'm starting with the question of double citizenship is ending. It may be yes, but there is something is on the rising. And what Michael Laguerre called it cosmo-nationalism, which broadly defines that we can talk about extraterritoriality of citizenship. No longer nation states are capturing all the citizens inside, and citizens living abroad must be part of the global citizenship. This is on the rise, and the literature is moving toward this. And also states' interest into bringing diaspora into their national electoral system toward overseas electoral system. States are on the rise as well. Back when I wrote a book on electoral diaspora representation system, 17 states were practicing this overseas electoral system, but now we have 18, 19 to my knowledge. And it's and also, as you may know, the France added 11 MPs plus they were having, they had since 1945 12 senator representing diaspora. And the Tunisian case, it's important, and I wrote a small book chapter in Turkish on how a Tunisian case can be as a model for Turkish in several ways. One is that Turkey's Tunisian case, Tunisian diaspora practices and the time and the sociology is so closer to those of Turkey. But there's other things that we need to underline here, is that Tunisia's need diaspora's inclusion after the Arab Spring is something that Turkey hasn't experienced, but there's a huge number of representatives. There are 18 members representing Tunisian diaspora from abroad. And there was one other point that you mentioned, is a polarization on the diaspora participation. And I'm not sure if I would, I mean, the literature I studied, I did not really come to this point, but it may be. But what we highlighted in our chapter is that there is this two ways of talking about diaspora representation. One came from diaspora itself. I mean, we investigated Turkish Grand National record books since 1950s, and we saw that huge demand come from diaspora, and they complain about Turkish politicians, that they are taking their money but not including them in the political system. So we investigated, we read dilekçes, statements from coming from diaspora, and on the other hand, we saw Turkish politicians are eager to talk about Turkish diaspora, especially when they realize that we no longer talk about gurbetçi. We talk about something more and more permanent Turks living abroad. I think I'm going to leave it at this point. And again, thank you, and for the opportunity to comment and present everyone.
Thank you, Necati. We've been running the program for about 2.5 hours, so I think it's time to wrap up. Although it's been a very fascinating intellectual experience. Before we wrap up, I would like to give the floor to our editors again, to Edip and Gülsen, to have their feedback, and then maybe we can conclude.
May I? Yeah.
Gülsen?
I'm starting. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Sadık Hocam, and thank you very much for everyone, for our contributors, discussants, and Hasret Hoca for her constructive feedbacks. And we are quite excited to launch our book. Hope the audiences and the readers will enjoy our book. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you. It's been like 2.5 hours, so we better stop here. Well, we wished to offer you some refreshments and maybe a dinner, but unfortunately it's not possible.
Online dinner.
Sometime in the future, maybe we can make this up. Thank you everyone for.
As we say in Turkish, okuyana çok olsun. Yüreğinize sağlık. Thank you all, and have a nice evening. Okay.
Herkese teşekkürler.
Mike,
thank you to all.
7 a.m. in the morning you wake up.
Yüz yüze de görüşmek üzere.
Thank you very much, Mike. Yes.
Okay. And thank you, Michael.
Take care.
Asaf Hoca, thank you.
Hoşça kalın.
Thank you very much.